The code compiled successfully, but no one stopped to ask what happens when it runs. Imagine one rule applied identically across a population, producing outcomes that look orderly while the people entering the process begin from very different positions. The fairness paradox appears when equal treatment is mistaken for complete justice. Identical rules can be consistent, yet consistency alone cannot settle whether their consequences are fair. That boundary remains connected to consequences. A system may apply the same threshold to each person. The ethical question is whether sameness of procedure should outweigh unequal circumstances, needs, and opportunities. That contrast remains bounded by purpose. Fairness is not one technical property waiting to be discovered. It is a contested moral judgment about which differences matter and which burdens require correction. That asymmetry remains linked to authority. This episode asks why equal treatment can produce unequal outcomes and why selecting a fairness rule is already a philosophical decision. That handoff remains important to affected people where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. To answer, we must distinguish procedural equality, equitable adjustment, equal opportunity, equal outcome, desert, need, and protection from domination. That condition remains limited by practical conditions, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Suppose two people face the same threshold but arrive with unequal access to preparation, resources, or recovery from error. The threshold treats them alike while affecting them differently. That choice remains worthy of explicit scrutiny. The rule may be neutral in wording and still preserve a disadvantage that developed before the rule was applied. That tension remains open to review once the process carries practical consequences. Now, unequal outcomes do not automatically prove injustice. They create a question about whether the differences reflect legitimate criteria or avoidable barriers. That limitation remains subject to justification without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. A fairness analysis must therefore examine both the rule and the social position from which each person encounters it. That priority remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. Procedural equality protects against arbitrary exceptions. It can make expectations clear and reduce the risk that decision-makers favor selected individuals. That relationship remains part of the design rather than disappearing behind the output. Yet procedure can become morally incomplete when it ignores conditions that determine whether people can use the opportunity the procedure formally offers. That safeguard remains inseparable from institutional choice as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. The distinction matters. Equal access on paper is different from meaningful ability to benefit from that access. That responsibility remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Equity responds by adjusting support thresholds or resources to account for relevant differences in starting position. That agency remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. That adjustment can improve practical opportunity, but it also raises objections about consistency, merit, and which differences deserve recognition. That authority remains within human responsibility, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. A desert-based framework asks what people have earned. A needs-based framework asks what support is necessary. A rights-based framework asks what treatment cannot be traded away. That consent remains visible during deployment. A consequence-focused framework may compare overall benefit, while a capability framework asks what real freedoms people can exercise after the decision. That fairness remains dependent on context before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. These frameworks can disagree even when they examine the same outcome. Their conflict is moral, not merely computational. That justification remains unsettled by technical performance once the process carries practical consequences. Technical success is not moral permission. A system can satisfy one fairness definition while violating another definition that protects a different value. That oversight remains necessary for accountable judgment without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. Pause and examine the trade-off. A fairness rule reduces one kind of arbitrariness while potentially creating another kind of burden. that contestability remains tied to real burdens, especially where affected people cannot easily object. The core mechanism begins with baseline selection. Any comparison requires deciding which starting point, group, outcome, or opportunity counts as relevant. That purpose remains ethically relevant rather than disappearing behind the output. Changing the baseline can change the fairness judgment. Equal results from unequal starting positions may look just under one frame and inadequate under another. That burden remains connected to consequences. Next comes metric selection. A designer can compare error rates, access, outcomes, treatment, or another property, but these measures answer different ethical questions. That trade-off remains bounded by purpose because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. A metric becomes misleading when it is treated as a complete definition of justice rather than one limited indicator. That assumption remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. Then comes incompatibility. Improving one fairness objective may worsen another because each objective protects a different distribution of benefit and error. That decision remains important to affected people where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. That conflict cannot be solved by optimization alone. Someone must decide which value has priority under the institution's purpose and constraints. That framework remains limited by practical conditions, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. We are still responsible. The algorithm may calculate the consequences of a chosen rule, but it does not justify why that rule deserves authority. That constraint remains worthy of explicit scrutiny. Power enters through selection. Those who define the metric decide whose disadvantage becomes visible and whose remains outside the evaluation. That incentive remains open to review once the process carries practical consequences. An apparently neutral model can therefore embed a prior moral choice about which differences count as relevant. That interpretation remains subject to justification, without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. Equal treatment also interacts with error. The same mistake may be recoverable for one person and devastating for another. That allocation remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. Fairness evaluation should consider burden, not merely frequency. Similar rates can conceal unequal consequences when people have different capacity to absorb error. That process remains part of the design, rather than disappearing behind the output. Another mechanism is feedback. A decision can alter future opportunity, and those altered opportunities can later appear as evidence supporting the original rule. That metric remains inseparable from institutional choice. This can make disadvantage look self-justifying. The process records an outcome partly shaped by its own earlier decisions. That objective remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. A feedback loop is not automatically unjust, but it deserves examination when the system's outputs influence the conditions it later measures. That exception remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. A defensible fairness process must therefore separate prediction from justification and outcome measurement from moral evaluation. That uncertainty remains within human responsibility, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. A reasonable counterpoint is that identical rules can protect people from favoritism, corruption, and unpredictable treatment. That benefit remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. That benefit is substantial. A system that adjusts too freely may hide arbitrary discretion behind the language of individualized fairness. That risk remains dependent on context, before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Another counterpoint is that institutions have limited information. They may be unable to measure each relevant circumstance without creating new intrusions or errors. That permission remains unsettled by technical performance. Of course, fairness must operate under practical limits. The absence of perfect information does not remove the duty to identify major, foreseeable asymmetries. That review remains necessary for accountable judgment. A legitimate case for uniform treatment appears when the relevant differences do not affect the moral purpose of the rule. That appeal remains tied to real burdens, especially where affected people cannot easily object. For example, equal procedural safeguards may be required precisely because personal variation should not change a protected right. That governance remains ethically relevant rather than disappearing behind the output. A limitation is that reasonable people can disagree about which differences are relevant, especially when values such as need, desert, and equality conflict. That accountability remains connected to consequences as long as the surrounding trade-off is acknowledged. The opening question can now be answered. The same rule produces different results because people encounter it with different resources, constraints, and exposure to harm. That autonomy remains bounded by purpose. Whether that difference is unfair depends on the purpose of the rule, the relevance of the starting conditions, and the ethical framework applied. That dignity remains linked to authority when the result begins to shape opportunity. Fairness, therefore, requires two judgments: whether the procedure is consistent and whether its consequences preserve a defensible distribution of opportunity and burden. That power remains important to affected people, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. Neither judgment can replace the other. Pure consistency can preserve disadvantage, while unconstrained adjustment can undermine predictability and equal standing. That context remains limited by practical conditions while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. The important distinction is between technical success and ethical justification. A fairness metric can inform judgment without becoming the final moral authority. That deployment remains worthy of explicit scrutiny before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. And yet, the choice of metric should be public enough to contest. People affected by the rule need a way to challenge the values embedded within it. That evaluation remains open to review. A stronger process states which fairness principle it prioritizes, why that principle fits the decision, and what competing value it may sacrifice. That consequence remains subject to justification without pretending that one framework resolves competing conflicts. It then tests whether the same rule creates burdens that are disproportionate to its legitimate purpose. That standard remains contestable in practice, especially where affected people cannot easily object. The practical goal is not perfect equality across several relevant dimensions. It is a justified relationship between purpose, treatment, opportunity, and consequence. That criterion remains part of the design rather than disappearing behind the output. Begin by asking what kind of fairness is being claimed. Equal rules, equal opportunity, equal error, equal outcome, and adequate capability are not interchangeable. That threshold remains inseparable from institutional choice. Next, identify the baseline. Against which starting point are people being compared, and why is that comparison morally relevant? That distribution remains open to revision because technical precision cannot settle moral priority. Examine who benefits from consistency and who pays when uniform treatment ignores unequal constraints. That procedure remains central to the moral inquiry when the result begins to shape opportunity. Then consider whether adjustment would correct a barrier or create a new form of arbitrary preference. That capacity remains within human responsibility, where power and exposure are distributed unevenly. Test the process under more than one ethical framework. Agreement across frameworks strengthens the case. Disagreement reveals the unresolved value choice. That role remains visible during deployment, while legitimate benefits remain part of the evaluation. Ask whether affected people can contest the metric, provide context, and obtain review without depending on hidden discretion. That transfer remains dependent on context before convenience hardens into unquestioned authority. Finally, make the trade-off explicit. Fairness improves when institutions admit which principle they chose and which competing concern remains unresolved. That result remains unsettled by technical performance once the process carries practical consequences. Not can we, but should we. A system deserves trust only when its fairness rule can be justified beyond the fact that it is consistently applied. That method remains necessary for accountable judgment. Equal treatment may be part of justice, but it is not the whole inquiry. That arrangement remains tied to real burdens. The machine is learning. The question is, what are we teaching it?